In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Christos Anesti. Christ is risen. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. That's what Juliet lamented as she discovered that her fair love, Romeo, was a Montague. That if he just had a different name, came from a different family, everything would be okay and the two would be able to wed and their lives would be perfect. But he bore this name which was an enemy to her, Montague. And she says, what's in a name? It doesn't really mean anything. A rose by another name would smell as sweet. And she actually goes on further and says that Romeo, if he were not called Romeo, would still be as perfect. Meaning if he were not a Montague, if he were not who he was by name, he would be as perfect. According to Juliet, the name that he bears has no impact on who he is as a person, who he is as a human being, and who he is in his core and his essence. It's simply a label that can be changed out without affecting who he is. And in this famous scene, Romeo is standing down on the ground, and he, in love, decides, yes, I'll throw away my name, but his understanding of what the name means is completely different from Juliet's. Because when he, in his great love for her, decides to cast off being a Montague, to chase after a Capulet, he says, and I'll be newly baptized, and I will never again be Romeo. He's willing to change the name. He's willing to forego and shun his father's name in the house of Montague. But what he understands is different from what Juliet understands. She thinks the name means nothing and he is who he is, regardless of whatever family he comes from, whatever upbringing he had. He is her Romeo, and that's who he is. None of the rest matters, especially not the label or the name. Where he, on the other hand, says, if I am truly to cast off this name that is an enemy to her, I'll have to be newly baptized. And as we as Orthodox Christians know, baptism is essential to our nature. It is essential to us as Christians. It is where, in fact, we receive our names. And so Romeo takes the opposite perspective. He says, my name is so much a part of who I am and so essential to my core that in order for me to get rid of it, I will have to be remade. I will have to be born again. I will have to be poetically newly baptized. He understands that the name is essential to his core and being. We hear in the epistle today that after the missionary works of Barnabas in the city of Antioch and their sojourn there for a year to teach and preach both to Jews and Gentiles, that the disciples were first called Christians. This is a new name, a name that didn't exist up until this time, up until the preaching of Christ in Antioch. Prior to this, the group that followed Jesus were described as members of the way, or followers of the way. They didn't really have a title, but that was the best that they could come up with and the best that other people would describe them and say that they followed the way of Jesus, or the way. But in Antioch, they received a new name. A name like Romeo understands, not like Juliet. A name that is essential to their being. They are now Christians, not following some philosophical way and teaching, but they are now identified in name as followers of Christ. And not just followers of Christ, but as they have been baptized into Christ, and it is no longer it is no longer they who live, but Christ who lives in them. They are Christians in the sense that they are united to Christ. They are Christ, and they are members of his body. And so this name of Christian, it's not just a label applied to a rose that would smell as sweet. It is a new way of being and a new way of identifying in the world, because our very core, in essence, has been remade. What does it mean then to wear the label of Christian? It means to be Christ. It means to embrace forgiveness and mercy, to hold fast to the truth and the preaching of the gospel. It means to be filled with the Holy Spirit and united to his Father. It means to care for the poor. It means to fight for justice and mercy. It means to be a peacemaker. It means to be humble. It means to be the Son of God here on earth. This is what all of us have endured and become when we, as Romeo says, were newly baptized, when we were reborn in the font of water and the Spirit. We should understand that children born into Christian families, as we understand it and our theology teaches, are not Christians. Not until they emerge from the font. Not until they are united to Christ. Not until they have put on Christ like all those baptized before them. So those of us who have been baptized into Christ and put him on are now Christians. Sadly and unfortunately, for many in the world, the title of Christian is viewed as similarly to the way Juliet views the name of the rose. That if you were to take away the title of Christian and all that comes with it, many people in the world, you'd see no difference in their actions. You'd see no difference in their interactions. You'd see no difference in their being. Strip away the title of Christian, and nothing changes. But that is not what we are called to be. That is not how Romeo understands it. That is not what we who have been baptized know to be true. And so when we hear this passing phrase in the epistle today, or in the book of Acts, that the disciples were first called Christians, and we use that term to apply to ourselves daily without thinking about it, understand what that means. Understand that it is essential to your core and your being, that as you have been reborn and united to Christ, you are no longer what you were, but you are now a Christian. And being a Christian means living as Christ did in the world. Nothing more and nothing less. It means to be Christ in the world and a member of his body. That is essential to who you are. As you go about your life, living and proclaiming that you are in fact a Christian, be it in word, in action, understand that you have been born into him as a member of his body, and you bear his name. As Juliet said, what's in a name? Everything. Our entire being. Our way of life. We are Christians. We are Christ.